Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a few weeks now since the death of George Floyd. It's been a few weeks since a police officer knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, killing him. And his death sparked protests on racial justice, the likes of which I haven't seen in my lifetime. There have been so many conversations going on in various spaces, in workplaces, on social media, on television, and in the church about racial justice, with people seemingly waking up to it. As we have these conversations, one of the questions that we want to ask tonight is whether the church is complicit. And tonight we're having a transatlantic conversation with Black Christians from the US and the UK to talk around these subjects. My name is Chine McDonald. I work for Christian Aid and I am a trustee of Greenbelt. I'm joined this evening by Professor Anthony Reddie, who is known to Greenbelt as well. His work lies at the intersection of Black liberation theology and practical theology. He's a Professor Extraordinarius with the University of South Africa in theological ethics and has been the editor of Black Theology, an international journal, since 2002. I'm also joined by Selina Stone. Selina Stone is tutor and lecturer in political theology at St. Mellitus College. She's also a part-time PhD student at the University of Birmingham, researching the impact of Pentecostal theology and ministry on issues of social justice. She has a master's degree in theology, politics and faith-based organisations from King's College London. I'm also joined by Jemar Tisby. Jemar Tisby is a Christian historian, writer and speaker. His first book, The Colour of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, was published in January last year. And he writes regularly on history, race, justice and Christianity. And finally, I'm pleased to be joined by Dante Stewart. Dante is a writer and speaker whose works have been featured in Christianity Today, The Witness, which is a Black Christian collective, Fathom Magazine, Faithfully Magazine, and the Gospel Coalition. And he speaks into areas of Black religion and theology. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me. We're going to start with 2-minute reflections from each of the guests on what this time is showing us about the church and racial justice. And I want to start with Professor Anthony Reddie.
Thank you. It's a great honour to be here among such distinguished individuals. I think what this time is showing us is that we have always lived in parallel worlds. We live in one world, but our experiences have not been synonymous. And so what this moment is showing both the church and the issue of racial justice is that chasm that has existed between different groups of people. So for some people, this is a remarkably new moment, that somehow they have woken up to the reality of racial injustice, of Black oppression, of white supremacy, and it's coming as a huge shock, and they're on a massive learning curve, and some people are learning to be allies and are learning to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed and marginalized. But then for other of us, it's like, well, quite frankly, this has been our world for years. Quite frankly, that's the fact that you've woken up to it, we're grateful, but it begs the question, how are you sleepwalking all through this in all the years that have gone by? That racism didn't start with George Floyd, it started 400 or 500 years ago. And that fact, if one goes back further, one can even trace it in terms of historical antiquity, in terms of anti-Blackness. So there's a sense in which part of the world is catching up to the reality of where another significant segment have been for many years. And it's almost like, so now welcome to the world that we've been in for centuries. Now what are you going to do about it?
Thank you. I'm going to go across the Atlantic to Dante.
Yes, I guess in some sense, this moment, in some sense for us, represents, a challenge and an opportunity. I think for many people, like Professor Reddie so wonderfully said, that this moment represents for them a new moment. It's a new moment of understanding. It's a new moment of awakening. It's a new moment of wrestling with various philosophical, political, theological questions that, many people, we have wrestled with this for centuries. In some sense, it's a challenge as well, in that, this moment once again is calling into the questions, to configurations of our political systems, our political economy, even the institutions that so long existed in power, whether it be in the social, political, religious sphere. And so that challenge is, in some sense, becomes, the question that Fannie Lou Hamer in the early 60s would have asked. She questioned America. In some sense, these moments represents a question, a challenge to, whether one believes one life is valuable, whether one believes one life matter, whether one believes one life is extinguishable and worthy of love and worthy of being fought for. And I think in some sense, this represents a grand opportunity for many people of, utilizing their voices in this moment to speak to the issues at hand. It represents an opportunity to recapture, a certain type of revolutionary and radical theology that in some sense wants to give voice to the liberating agenda of scripture itself, but also give voice to, liberating communities who have long been doing this work. I mean, Brother Jemar, this week, on the New York Times bestseller list, and many Black thinkers in our country who have long been doing this work. Some of their books came out 2 years ago, and now it's finally catching traction. And in some sense, we're thankful for that opportunity it represents. It represents an opportunity to imagine something different. At every moment of challenge, it presents for us an opportunity to, dismantle and reconstruct something better, in which a loving and just society and democracy and experience becomes the guiding reality for many people.
Thank you, Selina.
I think for me, I've been reflecting a lot on this moment, particularly theologically, and what it's revealed to us about the inherent dualisms that I think exist in our theology and our practice so often. And I think particularly about churches, and I think this works whether you're thinking about in the UK or the US, we've had this idea that we can have a gospel that's disembodied, where we have a sense of a very spiritual understanding of what it means for us to experience God and for humans to experience liberation and even salvation. And we've seen this as something that happens in a spiritual sense, but have not considered what the implications of the gospel are for us as embodied beings. And I think this has been revealed so much in the responses that we've seen from some of our church leaders, who I think have fallen into the trap of thinking you can pastor a congregation spiritually without having awareness of their embodied realities, and without having an awareness of how they're experiencing the life that you're speaking into as a pastor and as a leader. And I think that's one of the key limitations that we've seen revealed in this, is that it's been so difficult for so many of our leaders to make the jump, because they've had to make a jump from a very spiritualized understanding of the gospel into thinking about the reality of human experience. So my hope is that this kind of awakening, and I guess we'll see whether it is a real awakening in kind of the years to come, but I think it really opened up the opportunity for us to form a deeper and truer, more integral gospel, where we begin to understand what it means for Christ to come to save us as humanity, as creation, in more ways than just the kind of personal, individual sense.
Thank you. Jemar, finally.
Yes, I'm about to lose it over here and start saying amen and shouting and clapping and everything.
I think that's
What
allowed.
everyone has said. I would agree with all the previous speakers. I think what this moment is revealing about racial justice in the church is really a tale of two churches, a tale of the church on the margins, if you will, in this particular moment, particularly the Black church tradition, and a tale of the church of the majority culture, the church that has held political and economic and other forms of power and control historically in our various countries. And as has been mentioned, some folks are late, they are tardy, and they are just starting to awaken to these realities. But I think, in these conversations, it can be easy to sort of center the focus and attention on the predominantly white churches and predominantly white Christian institutions. And I think the much more interesting story is the prophetic tradition that's coming out of marginalized churches and communities. And so I think to folks like Bree Newsom, who is an artist and activist and a Christian here, and in the wake of the Emmanuel 9 tragedy, which just had its 5th anniversary this week, she climbed the flagpole in front of the State House in South Carolina and physically took down the Confederate flag that was flying there, was promptly arrested because of it. But now 5 years later, even an institution like NASCAR is banning Confederate iconography, Confederate flags, which if you'd have told me that 2 months ago, there's no way I would have believed you. But that kind of tradition has been there. Dante or Stu, he mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. You know, she's fighting in the 1960s and 70s for voting rights as an outgrowth of her Christian faith. And here we are in 2020 fighting vigorously against voter suppression and for the basic right of one person, one vote. So it's really a story of the rest of the culture and the rest of the country catching up to what the Black prophetic tradition has been saying for generations.
So does anyone want to respond to what they've heard in other people's 2-minute reflections? Well, let's just carry on then. So I want to stick then with the US Church and speak specifically to Dante, who I'm now going to call Stu, and Jemar. How would you characterize the response of the US Church to Black Lives Matter? So as you were just talking about a tale of two churches, what has the response been? Particularly from your own church traditions, and what are you observing in terms of the US Church response? Stu.
Wonderful. So I guess yes, particularizing my church tradition. So I'm a part of the Progressive National Baptist Convention. I'm here in Augusta, Georgia, at Tabernacle Baptist Church. Tabernacle and the Progressive National Baptist Convention has been a part of a long tradition of integrating one's faith into the public sphere, and that does not present, in some sense, a relinquishing of faith or reductionistic faith, but in some sense it presents a type of liberating and revolutionary faith that wants to bear witness both to the action of God in human life, but also the action of God particularized to the Black religious experience, and not simply the Black religious experience, but the Black existential experience in America. And so I would say, in some sense, it depends on which church tradition you read Black Lives Matter through to kind of navigate how one responds to Black Lives Matter. Now, in conversations today, I just put out a video today, yesterday, why I agree both with the message and the movement of Black Lives Matter. And conversations today in various churches and spaces today, you have people saying, I agree with the message of Black Lives Matter, but I don't agree with the movement. I get it. I trust me, I get it. People, in some sense, in the white evangelical space, they all, there is almost this kind of pressure to distance oneself from Blackness, to distance oneself from any type of control of the narration of struggle for social change. And so I think, on the one hand, I think, we have, I guess, if one is speaking institutionally from a white evangelical standpoint, one has, responded not well to Black Lives Matter, both as a message and a movement. If we think about it, I mean, Trayvon Martin was brutally murdered in 2012, and this is the year of our Lord 2020, and people are still asking the question, what happened? It's like, I'm like, Black Lives Matter, came into formulation, if I'm not mistaken, right after that. And, I guess for me, how I respond to Black Lives Matter, I agree, both with the message and the movement, particularly theologically, politically, and historically. So theologically, as a Christian, I think our first fundamental commitment is to the Imago Dei. And if one is first fundamentally committed to the Imago Dei in another human being, that means that they have something to offer to the world that one can build together, that one can learn from, that one must integrate one's struggle for life together with. And so, then after that, then I respond to them as, whoever they are. And so, as Christians, I believe that our commitment, particularly on a public sphere, is not to create a Christian nation, but to be Christians inside of a society working for a more loving and just world. And whatever those particular commitments are within a message and a movement, one in some sense should, readily, get behind that particular work. And, I would wonder, what is one's alternative to Black Lives Matter that stands in the face of Black death in a society that often forgets? And so Black Lives Matter as a message and a movement in a world of anti-Blackness, they work for dignity. In a world of oppression, they work for power. In a world that forgets, they work to remember one's dead. In a world that's built on segregation, Black Lives Matter as a movement and a message works for solidarity. And I think, if we're honest, many people in the movement are Christian. They are Christian, rooted in traditions. And I think, if we read Black Lives Matter through the Christian right tradition, then we would say Black Lives Matter is, a tradition, that they say that they shouldn't give with. But I think there's a writer here, Jack Jenkins, who just wrote a wonderful book, American Prophets, which wants to read political or religious movements through the lens of the religious left. And if we really read those movements through the lens of the religious left and allowing them to testify the scripture, then I would say, one should agree that they are doing the work of the Spirit. They're doing work, that is liberating and reconciling work in society. So I think, it depends on which movement we read it through, and that pretty much determines how we respond to it. But I think, politically and historically, Christians in some sense should respond readily to Black Lives Matter, representing Black people, forcing does Black Lives Matter on as a political commitment, and, being in the tradition of the civil rights movement that integrates faith and political theology and political practice as a spiritual virtue for a more loving and just world. So hopefully that answered your question. Hopefully.
Thank you. I can see Jemar's wanting to come in there.
Oh, Stu is preaching. Well, I can hear it coming out. I like it. And I think that's appropriate. My goodness, Black Lives Matter is such a theological statement, right? The way I often refer to it is it's a cry of lament. It's a crying out to God, as in Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, right? And it's almost a prayer where we say Black Lives Matter, and it can have a question mark at the end. Black Lives Matter, don't they, God? And will you show up, and will you show us that Black Lives Matter? But at the same time, it is an assertion, like Stu said, it is an assertion of the Imago Dei, that Black lives do indeed matter, because we are created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we have inherent dignity and inherent worth, and there is no way we should be treated the way we're being treated right now, particularly as it relates to anti-Black police brutality. And so I think it's a powerful statement, and it's a statement that's in a long tradition of Black people protesting for their fundamental rights and humanity. And so you can go back to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s in Memphis, when the sanitation workers were striking. They held up signs saying, "I am a man," meaning I am a human being, an inclusive term, right? You had James Brown saying, "Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud." You have others saying Black is beautiful, right? These are all the ways that we are attempting to assert not only our basic humanity, right? Like I've seen protest signs saying that Black Lives Matter is the bare minimum, right? Just saying that we matter. My goodness, that's all we're asking. And that is the bare minimum of what we should be attributing to the humanity of people of African descent. I will say this, as far as the response of the church in the US to Black Lives Matter, both as a movement and a sentiment, is Jonathan Merritt, who is a journalist. He's a white guy, but born and raised in the Southern Baptist Convention, and has since distanced himself from that and has some, I think, really sharp critiques of the white evangelical church in the US. He said recently on Twitter that most white Christian leaders are 2 or 3 good questions away from revealing white supremacist views. 2 or 3 good questions away. And I think that is so true. So what we're seeing now is a lot of social media posts, a lot of statements coming out in support of Black lives, maybe even people saying Black Lives Matter. You have former presidential candidate Mitt Romney, who's a Mormon, marching in a protest and putting out a tweet that literally says Black Lives Matter. And that's a big shift from just 5 years ago when it was a topic of national conversation in the US. At the same time, if you peel back the layers, I think that many people who are just now coming into this, particularly white evangelical Christians, have a very shallow understanding of what Black Lives Matter truly means, because it's at some point has to come down to policies, has to come down with to racist policies that perpetuate inequality between the races. And so that goes to how you vote in national and state and local elections. That goes to what organizations you support, all of those things. And so I think what we're seeing now is a very public assertion on the part of white Christians that Black lives matter in their understanding of it. What I'm questioning is how deep that understanding is. And then I think from the church on the margins and the Black church tradition in particular, I think what's very interesting is, from my reading, the 21st century civil rights movement is still very religious in general. Jewish people, Muslims, other traditions, including Christians, but it's also much more decentralized than what we've seen in the past. And so Christians have been sort of in and among the protesters and uprisings all across the country and all across the world. It may be a little harder from an outside perspective to identify, oh, they're with a church, or they're a clergy member, or whatever it might be. And so I think there's a tension there. I think we should ask ourselves questions about what is the role of, quote unquote, the Black church. Not that we're monolithic, but what is the role of the Black church or Black churches in the current movement? And also, you know, are there ways that the Black church has not had the prophetic voice that it has been known to have in the past? I don't know, but it's a question that we ought to ask. But on the flip side, we ought to be asking, well, how does the Black church show up, and how are Christians showing up in this present moment? And if it looks different, does that mean it's better or worse, or is it just different? So I think those are some analytical questions that we need to be asking in order to leverage and capitalize on this moment for justice.
Thank you. And we from the UK then have been obviously watching what's been happening in America, and it's not just something that has happened in America anymore. It's having, you know, a ripple effect in our country. And I want to bring in Anthony and then Selina to give their response to what they've heard from a UK perspective, from a Black Christian perspective, and your thoughts, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you to Stu and Jemar for so eloquently, I think, outlining the situation as they see it from within the US. I think what I hear, and I think my initial response is to take us back and to remind us of a deep irony here. That just to make the phrase Black Lives Matter shows the inherent contradiction in what it means to be a Black human being, where even having to make the statement shows the absurdity of our lives. That actually that we shouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter, because, as my two brothers have said, being human beings, creating the image and likeness of God, says that our lives matter anyway. So even having to create a movement shows the deep complexity of the nature of Black non-being. A friend and colleague of mine, Professor Anthony Pinn, in the early 2000s, I think 2003, wrote a fantastic book called Terror and Triumph. And Terror and Triumph, I think the subtitle is The Meaning of Black Religion. And basically what he says is, he says Black religion, and he's talking particularly in the African-American tradition, the African-American prophetic tradition, he says, is this quest for complex subjectivity. It's this sense of what does it mean to be a human being with agency, with the ability to do all the things that human beings take for granted, that we're not objects, we can create meaning, we can define ourselves, we can name ourselves, and we have a sense of imagination that enables us to transcend all the normal privations that face us in terms of being a human being. It's simply the ability to stand in front of the mirror look at yourself and say, I recognize myself. That is me. That's who I am. And I have value and worth. It's something that virtually every other race, in inverted commas, because there's no such thing as race, there's only a human race, but the sense in which every other group takes that for granted. For particularly for diasporan Africans, we are the one group who have even had to argue just on the very basis of being a human being. So we start with a deficit. We don't start at the starting line like everyone else. We start 15, 20 paces back. And so Black Lives Matter, as I think it was what Jemar says, that actually that Black Lives Matter is the bare minimum. It is just to get us to the starting line. It's just to get us to the line to say, actually, we are human beings like everybody else. That is an absurdity, and yet it has been necessary because we have not always been fully human. In the US Constitution, was it 3/5 of a human being? That actually, until the end of chattel slavery, we were not full human beings, and we're still not. I think within the British context, and this has always been my observation compared to America, where as a Black liberation theologian, I know I'm something of a rare species over here. I mean, it's probably just myself and Selina and Robert Bedford and a couple others one could name. And so there's a sense in which when I go to America and I go to something like the Fund for Theological Education in the US, which is a body that supports Black scholarship, and you see more Black people who are qualified theologians in one room than in the whole of the UK, what that then says to me is that what we have over here is that we've never had the equivalent of a Black prophetic tradition in its holistic sense. We have elements of it in our various different traditions. So within Black Pentecostalism, for which Selina can speak about much more eloquent than I can, you have a strong cultural element that retains a sense of Black self-determination in a way in which someone like myself who belongs to a Methodist tradition, in which there are Black congregations and a Black tradition, but it's housed within a white institution. So in my context, I learned Black theology very early on as part of a radical tradition that comes out of Methodism and John Wesley, but it's downplayed and undercut by white authority, who will pay lip service to Black agency. And then when it suits them, or put it another way, when it no longer suits them, it's interesting that it suits them at the moment, by the way. So, so at the moment, I'm their favorite Negro now, That all of a sudden, all roads come to the door of Anthony Reddie because Anthony, please speak to us. 2 or 3 years ago, couldn't give my stuff away. So I think part of the challenge in our British context is how do we create a prophetic movement of Black self-determination that isn't spiritualized, as Selina said in her opening comments, is not overly pietistic. It incorporates a kind of a notion of integral mission that has a strong sense of social justice, but is not overly dependent upon a liberal theology that lacks a sense of prophetic power. We struggle to have that in Britain because we've never had that Black independent tradition that exists in the US. Not that the model in the US is perfect by any means, because in that context, we also see a rise of very sort of conservative neo-Pentecostalism that is happy to do deals with white hegemony and I would say bluntly, sell out Black folk at the altar of capitalism. So of course it's not perfect, but I think that what I'm seeing in the UK is that we need our own type of reformation. Like there was a reformation in 1517. What we need is a new reformation in 2020 that transforms our nature of being Christian in the belly of the beast. So it's important to remind ourselves that certainly that for myself and Selina and for Chine, we are in the epicenter of what has still been the biggest empire the world has ever seen. At its peak, 24% of the world were all those bits in pink on the globe. And what I have tried to show a lot in my work is that although empire has gone, we have internalized a type of colonialism that has led to a form of mission Christianity that is disembodied, is apolitical, and has never been committed to Black bodies, even when it's Black people who are propagated it.
Oh, wow. Selina, over to you, your response.
I mean, Anthony, you've said so much. I feel quite excited at the prospect of Black churches in the UK having an appetite, particularly for things like community organising. Because one of the things that pushed me to my PhD research was wanting to interrogate why it seemed like a challenge for Pentecostal churches, and this is the truth for many Black churches, to engage politically. Because historically, we've always done the social welfare stuff really well. We've done the feeding our neighbours, caring for each other's children. We've even done marches, we've gathered around housing, we've thought about Pentecostal credit unions. But when it's come to tackling those bigger systemic issues, there's been a kind of a reluctance to engage in that sense. And I do think that there is now a kind of realization that those kind of short-term social welfare type projects are not sufficient for doing the work that's really necessary when it comes to guarding that imago Dei that you were talking about, Stu, and taking that seriously. Like anything that threatens that for people is part of the mission of the church, to oppose, resist, and engage in warfare against that, if we want to use very Pentecostal language. That's a core to that whole thing. And I think I wanted you to say a little bit on what you were saying, Jemar, about whether white churches understand what Black Lives Matter means. I think that is such an important point, because we've seen a similar thing here of white church leaders attending marches, putting out the hashtags, doing Blackout Tuesday. Meanwhile, many Black members in their congregations have been actively talking about inclusion in their churches over the course of years, and action hasn't been taken. So I think there's a sense of that, yes, you can put a hashtag and say Black Lives Matter. Yes, you can even put go to a march, put the picture on Instagram. You can do all those very visible PR type things. But when it comes to sharing power in your church congregation, that's when we'll see if Black lives really do matter. When it comes to deciding who's shaping culture, who's shaping leadership, what are the cultural norms that are valued and celebrated, that's when I think we're really going to see if Black lives really do matter. And I think for me, my concern is the well-being of Black people in Britain at the moment, and Black people in churches. And the stories that have been coming out about spiritual abuse, racial abuse in so many white churches in the UK, where many have suffered in silence or mentioned it briefly, it hasn't been taken seriously or acted upon. And so now my concern is, how do we do the work of healing of Black people who have gone to churches thinking they would be safe and they haven't been? And how do we think about what it means to heal that spiritual trauma? And the racial trauma is kind of a double-edged sword at the moment, and how do we heal that? So I think that's really important for us to be considering at the moment as well.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on that idea of Black trauma, and I feel like the past few weeks I have relived a trauma that I never actually knew myself, almost the trauma of Black people who look like me over the past centuries. And I want us to talk now, if we can, personally, about whether there's been a moment or moments over the past few weeks where you have felt despair, disappointment, righteous anger. Stu, I know you wrote about Black rage, and I wonder if you could speak into that. I know that we talk quite positively about the potential change that we seem to have seen, but have there been things that have made you really angry in the past few weeks? Stu?
Well, wonderful. Thank you for that question. When I look at this kind of situation, the questions change when you have a son. Like when you have children, the whole kind of the framework of the question changes. The pressing nature of the question changes. When you are, when you deal constantly with, this kind of narrative, as many call it, of racial difference, or you feel the brute force and brutal nature of white supremacy in both its overt and covert form, we have to ask, what is it doing to us? Professor Elizabeth Alexander out of Harvard just wrote a brilliant essay in the New Yorker entitled The Trayvon Generation. And what she brought out in that particular essay was this kind of, question of what is this moment doing for Black young people who see their peers, who are forced to see their peers be brutally murdered in very public ways that they didn't ask for. It just appeared across their screen. And the questions that I've been wrestling with over the past few weeks, yes, that piece that I wrote on Black Rage grew out of is the question of, how does theology communicate in the face of Black death? What is the good news for Black people as we're living under the tragic conditions of white supremacy? That, as Professor Charles Mills would say, that this kind of white supremacist capitalist logic is built on second-class citizenship, racist exploitation, and racial disrespect. How does one respond in that moment? Well, for me, it was giving voice to Black rage. And, it wasn't kind of a new kind of formulation of language or reflection, theological reflection, but for me, it was old language. It kind of really grew out of my reading of James Cone. James Cone, the wonderful Black liberation theologian of 1969 and 1970, kind of blew up in the country with his writings, Black Theology and Black Power, and the theology of Black liberation. And one of the things that Cone really captured for us is this narrative that rage or anger can become a virtue that burns away the illusion that the world as it is the world that God wants. Mm. And the reality is that Cone was not making up new language either. Cone was simply telling the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, if we kind of know Nehemiah's story, Nehemiah, much like Black people on this globe, he comes from a people who in some sense have been taken from their land. They are now brought into this new place in which they are not respected. They're second class. They are disrespected continually. They're in a situation of a given system of injustice. And, Nehemiah, he hears word and he must respond to it. So he responds in prayer and he, has favor with God, and then he goes out and goes back to his people. Then in Nehemiah chapter 5, the Bible, and I love this, the Bible says that, Nehemiah hears the cries of the people. He allows them to speak of their anguish and their suffering. He gives voice to their suffering. Then Nehemiah responds this way. He doesn't, their suffering is not just spiritual. Their suffering is both political and economic. And there are policies and practices whereby they are negatively affected, not simply in their view of themselves, but their ability to be agents and shapers in their destiny. And so in some sense, they are dealing with the colonial project. They're dealing with this given system of injustice. And Nehemiah, in verse 6, says, after he heard, he was very angry. And he thought about it, he prayed about it, and then he brought charges against the officials. And for me, as Rowan Williams, someone the UK is very familiar with, dear Rowan Williams would say, when we approach the Bible, in some sense we see, in some sense we should allow the Bible to shape our stories. It's our story entering to the story of the Bible, and these stories trying to tell a better story together. And so as I looked at Nehemiah's story, I realized that Black rage in the anti-Black world is a spiritual virtue, because it wakes us up out of our illusion that Black people are okay with our position and that it is God's will that we remain oppressed. And that's just not the case. It is God's will that we think it over, that we become angry, and our anger move us to action, whereby our society becomes the place where we are held accountable, not only to God, but also to one another. And so it becomes a spiritual virtue, a moral obligation, as well as a political practice and commitment. And so for me, this moment has represented giving voice to Black rage, not as antithetical to Christian virtue, but as a fundamental public expression of the theological commitment that Black lives don't simply matter to God, but Black lives matter to us. And the question is, does God love Black people, but does our society? And we are those who are inside of our society, fundamentally forcing that question upon them with our voices, with our vision, and with our practice.
Yes, 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 yes. Who wants to come in, respond? Is there anything that's burning you want to say? Anthony, Jemar, Selina?
Just very, very quickly, I think for me, the moment I became hugely angry, because I thought, in a sense, nothing's changed, was when the reactions to the statue of Edward Colston Bristol being pulled down. And on my Facebook page, made up of very, very good, decent, liberal individuals, I'm sure many are listening and watching this as we speak. The number of people who said, oh, but this is just wanton vandalism. This is not the way this should be done. It's terrible that this statue should be pulled down. And I thought, well, there we go again. It's the sense in which property always matters more than Black people and our feelings. Property, because that's the basis on which capitalism operated, turning us into property, always matters more than our feelings. So the fact that there was a long, peaceful campaign for many years to have this statue moved and was ignored, not even a dialogue, just ignored completely. And even as late as 2018, there was an attempt to simply put a plaque. Let's put a plaque on this just to say this man was a slave owner. No, sorry, slave trader. At least let's name what he was, and even that was rejected. So there's pathetic action. That gets pulled down. And typically, middle class, respectable people are more concerned with the proprieties of law and order than they are about justice. And the fact that for many years we have suffered in silence the indignity of having a statue and many things named after a slave trade, as if somehow that is a morally neutral activity that this individual was doing. We don't have statues like to Nazis. We don't have statues to child abusers. We don't have statues to people who create genocide, but somehow a statue to a slave trade and that being pulled down, it being pulled down is worse than the fact that it existed in the first place. I literally had to go for a long walk because I thought to myself, if I have access to a blunt instrument and if I'm in too close proximity to people, I'm going to do jail time, and I'm too much of a coward to find myself in jail. So I literally had to go for a walk and just recite several psalms. I remember actually what my mother used to tell me. So, I mean, she was the best Christian I've ever met, and she would always say, Anthony, you cannot allow the devil to shortchange your vocation in life. Because simply at that moment, I felt such anger and rage because I thought to myself, even in the midst of a Black Lives Matter movement, there are still decent people who just don't get it. Who just don't get it. And somehow our feelings are always secondary to a sense of propriety around white order and property.
So I want to dig in then to that idea of Black people over the centuries being treated as property and the brutality of Black bodies. And I wonder whether it is that specifically in the scenes that we saw of George Floyd's death and the manner in which he was killed, which has potentially sparked something in us. For a lot of Black people that I speak to, we saw ourselves in him, in his body. I had a moment this week where I'd been listening to Jemar's book on my morning walk, and I came back and I was in the kitchen and I was retelling some horrific stories to my husband, and I was shaking with disgust, rage, anger, fear, anxiety. When you write about Emmett Till being killed for whistling at a white woman, or Black women, a Black woman being gang raped by white men, or the conditions of Black slaves in slave ships. I want to speak to you, Jemar, about what that was like for you writing about those moments of the brutality of Black bodies.
It was terribly difficult. And I think more people need to realize that as Black scholars, as Black writers who write about our experience and the history of our experience, this takes an emotional toll. Writing about the rape of Reese Taylor, who I'm relying on the work of other historians like Danielle McGuire, was gut wrenching. Reading about lynchings, it was absolutely terrifying, and knowing that in some sense we still live in the shadow of that reality. So it's not simply looking back at the past and saying, oh, how bad that was, thank goodness we're in a better place now. It's realizing that that was terrible, and in many senses we have not moved beyond it. Maybe it's changed forms, but we're still living um, in a terrorized kind of state, especially when it comes to the police. I cannot describe to you that surge of adrenaline that I get when I see those flashing blue lights, or even just pass, a police officer, a police vehicle. And that's the what psychologists would say, the fight, flight, or freeze reflex. This is battle mode that because of terrorism we have been conditioned to have in the presence of those who are ostensibly charged to serve and protect. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, The Color of Compromise, is to reveal the grisly, brutal, violent nature of white supremacy. And that's something that we don't talk about nearly enough. It's something that we respond to viscerally when we see the murder of George Floyd, but to realize this is a pattern that's hundreds and hundreds of years old, and even a global phenomenon. What I really want white people in general and white Christians to understand is that Black people respond so vigorously to any hint of racism because we know deep in our souls that the logical end of white supremacy is Black death. Black death in many forms, emotional and spiritual, but also physical. So this is literally life and death stuff we're talking about, which is why so many of us protested so vigorously against the election of the current US president, is because we knew in his words and his rhetoric that it was going to incite and inflame people to lean in to their already uh, uh, deeply held white supremacist views, and at some point it was going to result in literal physical Black death. So it is gut wrenching to study these things and to talk about them and write about them, but we do it because it's a matter of survival. We do it because if we don't, then we risk perpetuating our own oppression through our silence, because people will think we're happy. Like Stu was saying, that unless we express this rage, unless we use our time and our talents and our energy to reveal our reality, then people will think we are content with our oppression, and that is simply not the case.
Thank you. We've got 10 minutes left, and I want to touch on white allyship. So a lot of the Greenbelt audience would be a majority white audience, and these are people who are allies and who want to help. And I'm going to come to Selina, and I wonder, I've some of my best friends are white. I've been contacted by a lot of white people over the past few weeks who seem stirred, who want to act, who want to do something. I want to ask what constitutes a good way to be an ally, and potentially what should people not do? Selina.
This is a good question. I went on a little bit of a Twitter rant about this a couple of weeks ago. And I think what I wanted to communicate was that there are Black people and Asian people who've been doing the work on racism, what it is, how to deal with it for a very, very long time. And so I think the starting point really is to do the groundwork of learning and listening, and to do all of that with the certainty that you're never going to be an expert on racism. And reading the books about race, reading books about white supremacy is never going to give you enough knowledge to be able to speak over Black people or Asian people when it comes to talking about racism. And I think that's important because I think we're seeing a lot of white leaders feel more bold about speaking about race and are saying some pretty reckless things in public because of the sense of they're one of the white people who knows. So I think having constant dialogue with Black people is important. Walking in step with your Black friends, colleagues who are doing the work, who are speaking, who are educating, but also decentering your interest as a white person is so important, and realizing that your quest for knowledge is not as important as Black people's wellness and the healing and the progression of the Black community. So some of the requests are going to have to wait for months, and that's okay because there's an urgency now to be seen to do something. But we have to live, and we still have to eat and sleep and have families and be. And so I think the kind of urgency can become a burden to us at a time when we're already dealing with the trauma of what's happening.
Thank you. Anthony?
Yeah, I think it's one of the great essays that I would encourage everyone to read. It's published in the Black Theology Journal I did by James Cone in 2003. And it says that theology's great sin is silence in the face of white supremacy. And therefore, I think for white people to be allies, the first thing they have to do is to deconstruct their whiteness. That's their fundamental responsibility, is to say, well, what is it about whiteness that is always predatory in terms of its need to suppress and oppress the other, particularly the Black other? That doesn't mean that every individual white person is a racist, but it does mean that they inherit a world of privilege simply by being the virtue of being white itself. And therefore, what then does that mean to critique and challenge, to create a constructive form of whiteness that does not necessarily need to be superior to? It can work alongside and in partnership with other people. And that's a big piece of work because, like all forms of pathology, it starts with first admitting that there's a problem. There is a problem with whiteness. And therefore, white people need to deconstruct that. What we don't need are people who want to speak for us. We're perfectly, as you can see this evening, we are perfectly eloquent as Black folk to speak for ourselves. We don't need to speak for us. However, what you can do is to be an advocate in those conversations where we're not in the room. I'm always curious about what my white friends are saying when I'm not there. Years ago, I used to get paranoid. Now, quite frankly, I don't care. I mean, actually, I work on a basis that as long as you behave yourself when I'm present, now that's what you get up to when I'm not there. Who knows? However, here's the thing. It is easy to let things pass or slide if it doesn't have an impact upon you personally. So for me, in terms of parallel, it took me a long time to realize that it was not up to my women friends like to challenge patriarchy. That was my job because I benefit from it. It's not our job to solve racism because that's not, we didn't invent it. Actually, whiteness and white supremacy did. Therefore, white people need to challenge one another, challenge attitudes, challenge ways of working, challenge even their sense of agency. That's the work that they can start with. I certainly agree with Selina. It's not then to ask us then that to turn up and to be spokespeople for other people's fragility and insecurity. I've lost count the number of times that people have said, Anthony, I really want you to help me. No, I'm sorry, it's not my job to help you. It's your job to help yourself like you're an adult. There are things to read, there are things that you can pursue. It's not my job to struggle with a form of double jeopardy, which is that somehow I have to try and narrate my own humanity and solve your white fragility at the same time. No, I'm not doing that. So deconstruct whiteness, take responsibility for your own actions in terms of challenging racism and challenging white supremacist attitudes when you come across them, particularly when Black folk are not there, and it will be easy to let it pass. And then also recognize the fact that this is a moment. It's not whether it's a definitive moment, history only alone will tell us. But however, don't assume that in the midst of activity at this moment in time, that somehow will solve it. Because what we know is that this moment, as in one sense, will pass. Like the media will move on to other stories. And some people who at the moment are taking the knee and are proclaiming an interest in Black Lives Matter, they will move on to other stuff, and we'll still be here having to deal with the crap that we've had to deal with for centuries.
Thank you. So as you said, this is a moment, we asked in this evening whether the church was complicit in racial injustice. And I wonder if each of us could end with just one hope for what you want to see from the church in the US and the UK to really make a difference in this moment. So I'm going to start with the US and I'll start with Jemar.
One hope I have for this moment pertains specifically to Black Christians. And I hope that Black Christians would feel the freedom to liberate themselves from white Christianity. Now, that has multiple layers. So we have to decolonize our theology and look to the liberatory tradition of Black Christianity, which has always affirmed our humanity and given us a language for asserting that. We have to liberate ourselves from white Christian institutions. And just to be real, that often comes down to money. If we're employed in these places or we are working in ministry and rely on financial support from these places, we had to do it in my organization, The Witness, and we have never had a lot of money, but we still here. And all I can say is if it costs you in terms of earthly possessions or material, God has got you. It is a leap of faith. It is a step of faith. But there are others who have done it. And I can tell you that freedom is well worth the price of whatever job or position that you may have to distance yourself from. And then on sort of an ideological level, freeing ourselves from this compulsion, this sort of internalized racism that we need the approval of white people and white Christians to do what we want to do what we need to do, and to be who we truly are. So I hope that this is an exodus moment for many Black Christians who are in predominantly white Christian spaces and have hitherto felt trapped or compelled to stay for some reason.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Selina, Stewart, and then Anthony. If you could answer in a sentence, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
I would agree with all of that. I am here for liberation theology at the centre of Black Christians every day of the week. I also would love to see political organising by Black churches. I'd love to see Black churches really getting involved with building Black power in the UK and taking our interests seriously, thinking about our economic future, and working with all groups of people who are fighting for liberation in the system that we are living in now, which is shaped so much by exploitation and inequality. So that's my hope.
I think for me, I would I should use a quote that comes from Desmond Tutu that says, "If you think you're too small to make a difference, then you've never shared a bed with a mosquito." And what I would love to see is individual Christians to take their agency and to say that every individual can make a difference. Most of us don't have the power to change the world, but what we can change is our own practice. How do we live out the gospel mandate of loving our neighbor as ourselves? Seeing in the other that divine spark of God that then says that they, as every human being, is worth treating with respect, because to do so is to attend to God's very self. And it's simple. But actually, if we did that, imagine how different the world would be just in terms of our social relationships if we were able to live that out, particularly if white Christians were able to believe that they themselves can make a difference in terms of being allies for racial justice.
Thank you. And final word to Stu.
Oh, wow. Well, great. Wonderful. I guess in this moment, just to piggyback off just the wonderful things that were shared, I think in this moment, the hope that I have in this moment is, that we are still here and that we're showing up every single day. You know, it takes tremendous courage, you know, to wake up every morning and to say we want to see a better world, especially to be Black. I mean, within the last 30 days, Black people have been incredibly traumatized, and we're still grieving, but we're still going. We're exhausted, but we're energized. We're wounded, but we're walking. And so for us, hope is not this kind of optimism that believes life will get better. Martin Luther King, 50 years ago, was murdered in a suit. And every successive decade, there has been a hashtag and a name associated with brutal Black death. And so this kind of language of hope, you know, becomes an incredible challenge for us as a kind of theory. But for us, even in this moment right now, as we gather together, hope is not a theory, hope is a practice. And for us, it becomes not a destination, but a discipline. And I think that's the hope in this moment, that each one of us has taken up, you know, as I guess the name is Dostoevsky. He says, if beauty will save the world, then our Black is beautiful, because we're doing the same.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being part of this conversation. I could talk to you guys for hours and hours and hours, but we have covered so much, and I just want to thank you for being part of this. Thank you, Professor Anthony Reddie. Thank you, Jemar Tisby. Thank you, Dante Stewart, and thank you, Selina Stone. And thank you guys for joining us.